And the meeting is now streaming on YouTube.
All right, well, welcome everyone to the Awareness Committee Task Force of the Human Rights Commission. We will go ahead and start with introductions. My name is Mike Waters. I'm the chair of the Awareness Task Force, a member of the Human Rights Commission. I live in Ward 7 and my pronouns are they and them, and I'll pass it to David.
Hi, my name is David Reinhold. I'm on the Human Rights Commission. I'm a resident of Polk County, and my pronouns are he and him. And I'll pass it to Trey Kiriko.
Hi, I'm Tricarica. I'm a resident of Ward 2, and I'll pass it. My pronouns are they, them, and I'll pass it to Linnell.
Hi, my name is Linnell, and I live in Ward 1, and my pronouns are she and her. And I'm just an interested community member, and I work at Safe Sleep United, which is a women's shelter.
And how about Marianne?
Sure, great. Hi, I'm Marianne Bradshaw. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am an instructor at Western Oregon, and we're working with the Human Rights Commission on an upcoming survey, so I'm here in regards to that.
And Linda, would you like to hello?
Sure. My name is Linda Rose, and I work in the city manager's office. I'm sort of kind of being Gretchen tonight, but during the day I am the assistant to the mayor. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
And we know we have Bria in the background for IT support. You're welcome to introduce yourself if you.
I'm good. I'll stay anonymous, but hello, good evening. I'm here if you need me.
All right. Thank you, Bria.
Thank you, Bria.
Well, we do have, first, is there any public comment this evening? And Linnell, I know you're here as a member of the public, but you can participate in our survey discussion during that time, or if you have comment you'd like to make preemptively, you're welcome to.
I think I'm just giving it along the way, or a summary, whatever works.
Okay, excellent. Well, with no public comment then tonight, we can look at the minutes. We do have a quorum here to approve the minutes. Did everybody get the minutes via email? Does anybody have any questions, comments to the minutes, or does anybody want to move to approve those?
I can make a motion to approve those.
I'll second the motion. Approve.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And no opposed. Okay, so the minutes are approved. And that takes us to our main topic for the evening, which is the survey work that we've done with the students. Gretchen sent out via email drafts of the survey questions, a link to the actual survey, which you are welcome to take. They will clear out the results before the survey goes live. So you can take the survey as many times as you want between now and the time it goes live. Tonight, Marianne is here to hear if there's any feedback, and Marianne also has a couple of specific follow-up questions. So I'll turn it to Marianne.
Great, thank you. I'm really happy to be here with you this evening and looking forward to input. Sometimes that input looks like, here's a big picture comment, and sometimes it looks like, hey, on this specific question, could we add an option or add an apostrophe? So all input is welcome. I think some of the questions are pretty quick to just like, but yep, we're on board. And that's exactly how we asked it last year. And some, I really am looking for a little bit more discussion. So I don't know if everybody had a chance to look at the questionnaire. If you have it in front of you, that's probably easiest. And we can just kind of use question number to refer to those. I feel like if we just start at the top, we may end up not having time to focus on the areas where we have the most questions or discussion. So I would like to, if you came into this meeting with a specific question that you wanted to discuss, maybe we start there. And then I also have a couple of questions that I would like to direct your attention to and say, hey, what would you think about this? Or help me talk to the students about that. So does that seem like a good process? Great. So if anybody came in and said, hey, I really wanted to make sure we talk about this, let's start there.
I have a question.
Please,
No
David.
comment. What grade level were we trying to stick at on the reading level? Was it 6th grade?
The target is 8th grade.
8th grade? So on the definition of discrimination, I was just wondering where the first starts, the unjust or prejudicial treatment of people. I wasn't sure if that was too high level or not.
Yeah, that's a great point. The definition is one of those pieces where we use it right off the bat as a foundation to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page as we're talking about it. And it actually is one that I hoped we could discuss tonight. So David, thanks for putting it on the table. There's kind of two pieces of it, this unjust and prejudicial treatment, and then the list of on the grounds of, and we have that list. The unjust and prejudicial treatment is phrasing that we used last year and actually in 2017. But I do feel like, especially prejudicial, it is a big word. And I think, you know, when you talk about prejudices and prejudicial, do you have a suggestion of a different word? Have you looked at, do you have something in mind that you would suggest?
I have no suggestions. I was just curious, but yeah. I've been thinking all day today, and I haven't been able to figure something else out.
Linnell, do you have an idea?
Maybe something like unfair and not the same as everyone else. And in the part where it lists the grounds, I understand that you're trying to stay consistent with prior years, but if the definition lists the grounds, but then you have like question 6 and 10 list grounds that include housing status, but the definition doesn't list grounds that include housing status. I wish it would be included in the definition as well for the consistency's sake, and also for acknowledgement that discrimination can happen based on housing status. So it also gives some validity to it. So I wish the definition would include housing status so that it connects to question 6 and 10, the list that's under those questions, and so that it validates that people are experiencing discrimination based on their housing status.
Yes, the list there is one that we copy and pasted out of, it's the HRC on your agenda and minutes. And we felt like using a list that you guys use made sense as a starting place. But I'm very open to input. We don't want, you know, it's a balancing act. We said, oh, is it overwhelming if the list is so long? But obviously we want to be inclusive in this space. And I read a definition the other day that only listed like grounds of 3 and then said not limited to, but these are most frequent. And I thought, I don't think we want to go to only 3. So I would be open to, I'm interested in input from the committee members. I'm happy to add housing status to that list. But if you say, hey, if this is the list we have been using, maybe there's value to you in using that list.
I tend to agree with Linnell, and I think that the consistency throughout this individual survey is important. So maybe even looking at the list that's in the later questions and mirroring that is maybe more important than mirroring previous surveys and sort of HRC wording, as it were. You know, housing status is one of those areas that we know is not currently included in Chapter 97, but there's some interest in our HRC of having that added to Chapter 97. And so being able to find out if housing status is an area where people are experiencing discrimination is important. And because we are making this significant effort to distribute the survey to the unsheltered community, having them see themselves represented in the very first question or one of the first questions, I think is an important marker. I also think from a comparison standpoint that it doesn't negate comparisons to the previous year's surveys to make that minor of a change in my view. So I would tend to agree with Linnell. Tricarico and David, I wonder if you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Linnell. That was one of the things I wanted to ask about was, what could we include in that first definition that matches? Because I'm noticing like there's that definition, but then the question that asks, what was the main cause has a lot more options. And I get that balance between not throwing all this stuff at people. I also started looking at some other language. I liked Linnell's suggestion of unfair because I think that's a pretty easy concept to understand. When you actually look at the simple English Wikipedia, they say discrimination is when someone is treated unfairly or differently. And that's pretty simple, right? Because the other piece to this is like discrimination really depends on your perspective, right? Like it really is subjective to that person's perspective and experience. They even have some really good examples in here, and it's a lot, but I'm wondering, could you have that simple definition and then maybe some examples? Because I know that was something that Linnell expressed of, she would be sitting there taking the survey and the person's like, no, I've never been discriminated against, like as a car is driving by yelling at them, right? Like, I really would like to be able to create some more connections for people. I know you don't want to get too complicated, but I do want to try to have some better language in there to include everybody.
Yeah, that's great. So I feel like in the definition, we've talked about treated unfairly or differently. And we've talked about like on the grounds of what we include there. I do really like the treated unfairly or differently language. I think that's straightforward. I think it's meaningful. I think it's clear. And I'm happy to look at the list, when we say what was the primary cause of this discrimination in your opinion, and make sure we have those pieces in that definition. It does add some length, but I feel like to be inclusive and to be consistent, adding a little bit of length there makes sense. The other side note I'll make, and I think this may apply to multiple conversations we have this evening, I'm going to say, oh, well, this is how we did it last year. I feel like there's value in consistency and being able to compare, but there's more value in asking a better question. And so if we look at how we did it last year, we'll get to a kind of an overall rating where we used a grading question last year. And if we say, if we change that question, we won't be able to compare to last year, but it's a better question and it gets at what we're looking for better. I think this year has been a weird year. There's no year like 2020. There's going to be a lot of other reasons that the comparison to the 2021 survey versus the 2020 survey may not match up exactly. And if we say, let's move away from a question that we don't think is as effective to ask it better. And then next year we can compare. I feel like, if it's 6 one way, half dozen the other, let's stick with how we did it before. But if we have an idea on the table that is better, then I think we move to what's better. And so I'm not stuck with, well, that's what we did last year, we can't change it. I think we ask it better.
I agree with you as well, Marianne, because our desire is to repeat the survey regularly. And so the more we improve the survey with each pass, the more likely, it's unlikely we would have to have the same exact conversation next year when we're working on this same survey. And then it will be comparable direct, exact wording will be comparable when we repeat the survey in future years. So fully agree, and thank you.
Great. So for this question on the definition, I'll use unfairly, treated differently, and we'll include the pieces from that list. I think it's question 6 and 9 about the causes of discrimination. So David, thank you for bringing the definition question up. I think we have a good plan for this one. Were there other questions that people came in saying, let's talk about this one?
I kind of feel like for me, it was really like going down in a row and just kind of identifying, well, what about this or that? But I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So if and when people want that, I can go through that. But
we could do that. I do want to make sure we have time to talk about the grading question, the overall rating. So if you don't mind if we talk about that one now, it is, I'm just going to scroll down in my document. It is question number, I'm almost there, 12. And the way that we have put it into the survey for this year as a placeholder says, overall, how would you rate Salem on being a place without discrimination? And the choices are excellent, almost no discrimination, good, small amount of discrimination, average, typical amount of discrimination, poor, quite a bit of discrimination, failing, a lot of discrimination, and then a prefer not to say or not certain option. In last year's questionnaire, we invited respondents to give Salem a grade on being a place without discrimination, and the excellent, good, average, poor, and failing line up to the A, B, C, D, F that was offered in the previous version. The students last year felt like, and they were trying to match the 2017 survey, that giving a city a grade, it was a little tricky. They thought it kind of felt a little odd, but they wanted to be able to compare. And I do feel like we're saying, here's the ideals, being a place without discrimination. How are we doing? And there's going to be a gap in every city. Like, is any place perfect? So giving that grade or rating, I think I like that we're asking an overall rating question, and it was a very useful question to us from an analysis standpoint last year to kind of say, here's my opinion on how Salem is doing. And we were able to compare, we could slice and dice the data and look at subgroups of respondents within the data on this kind of overall rating, overall opinion question. So I think it's valuable to us to have a question like this, but I do think that the wording is a little tricky. And I wondered how the group feels about this version, or if you have other suggestions, or if you're wanting to consider some other ideas. And then we did just add an overall, like an open end after that question to say, kind of tell us why you gave it that rating. So that pair of give us a grade, but this year we're asking for a rating, and then just explain why. What do you guys think about those questions?
I think the question I had is, what is a typical amount of discrimination? Like, that's the only one that caught me. Like, maybe that could be worded like similar discrimination to other places. That's what I was thinking. When I took up the survey, I was like, okay, but I don't even know. Like, how do you quantify that?
We started with average as the rating is average. And I was like, do people know what is average, and average in Oregon or average in the US? What's the average amount? How many? I don't know. And typical, I do think that we should noodle on that one a little bit more, because like you, I'm like, what is typical? I don't know. What is average? What is normal?
I'm wondering if it could be like the same discrimination that I've experienced in other cities, slightly less discrimination than I've experienced in other cities, almost no discrimination, right? Because it's like there has to be a baseline. But then the problem is, since we've all lived in different places, like that kind of throws it off too, So I don't know.
And some people haven't lived anywhere else.
Yeah. Linnell, you had some ideas. What do you think?
I had less ideas about that, like maybe like high, medium, low, but that would definitely be subjective, and almost none or none. Um, but yeah, the typical and average was hard for me to like wonder how do people identify what that would be? But people usually have a feel like on 1 to 10, what scale would you put it? So like high, medium, low, none or almost none might make sense. And then just the following question, it's a little leading as far as like Salem has no discrimination. So I'd almost just stop that question with like, please comment why you gave Salem that rating and stop there. But yeah, so the closest I could come up with is like high, medium, low, almost none and none. But I don't know if that's, I don't know. It's still going to be subjective.
It is a perception question and it is a subjective question. So I am not concerned about it being subjective. It's a survey, and virtually every question could be subjective in some respect. I kind of understand the students' desire not to use letter grades. It gives us all school trauma. It's just sort of it was useful. I will say it was useful in communication, because when the final survey results came out and we could say that it was a C+, everybody kind of has an idea of what a C+ might mean. In a subjective way, because it's purely subjective. I wonder about, I don't have an answer for the typical, because your example, Tricarigo, is exactly right. Some people have never lived anywhere else. So they're comparing it to maybe an ideal. They're maybe comparing it to what they see from relatives that live other places or other places they visited. It's a purely subjective rating, but it gives us a valuable barometer of how people are feeling. And so when we repeat the survey in future years, we'll be able to see, are people feeling better about the level of discrimination in Salem, or are they feeling worse? And so that is useful information. I wonder about a number scale. Keeping maybe the same categories, but assigning numbers to them, because sometimes people can, in their heads, say, okay, if it's on a 5-point scale, it's definitely a 3 or it's definitely a 2. Like there is something about even the grading scale that had a tangible quality when you assigned a number to it, whereas the current scale doesn't have that tangible quality. But I think no matter how we word it, no matter how we sort of organize the information, it's always going to be a subjective question that is based on perception. And some of the survey is intended to measure perception. So I'm not super uncomfortable with that, as long as we know going into it that that's what we're measuring.
Oh, I'm wondering if, to give it like a framework, like you're talking about, Mike, could we mirror question 9, where it talks about when discrimination happened, as like a frequency thing, right? So like an A would be, I perceive, witness, whatever discrimination, or I see, experience it, once every 3 months versus once every 6 months, or something like that. You know what I mean? Like a frequency. I mean, because the other thing I was thinking about is like, what is an acceptable level of discrimination to the people taking our surveys? Hopefully that would be 0, but we've all had that conversation with someone where a comment was said and they're like, oh, that's just how they are. Like clearly there is a level that some people will tolerate and others will not, right? So I'm wondering if the frequency, like this is how often I experienced discrimination or I witnessed discrimination in Salem, would be a way to measure that. I know that kind of makes it hard to compare to past, but it would, I think, help give it some kind of context, because it's still a perception question, right? Like what I perceive as discrimination might be different than what like Mike perceives or something like that. But as a way to kind of also keep some consistency throughout the survey when we ask people about it. Just an idea, I'm not committed to it.
The
I
students
just
talked
wonder
about-
if the desire to make it tangible, and see, I feel like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth right now, so I apologize, but I wonder if the desire to make it tangible is sort of not honoring what we want to find out, which is how do people feel about it? How do people feel about the city that they live in? And so I struggle with making it so tangible that we aren't really measuring how people are feeling or what their perceptions are. And Marianne, maybe you have you started to chime in before I interrupted, so maybe you have some thoughts about how do you measure a feeling?
A couple thoughts, and then I know Linnell has a thought as well. We had talked about in class the frequency question, and the students were concerned that a frequency question doesn't take into account the intensity of a discrimination incident or experience. So somebody might have microaggressions that they experience every day that they live with, and so that frequency would be very high, but somebody else might recognize infrequent experiences, but that are bigger, stronger, heavier. And so if it's exclusively a frequency question, then there's a concern that we're not really getting the full picture. We don't have to ask this in only one question. I mean, we could ask a frequency question, and we could also ask how do you feel Salem is doing? Like, what is your opinion on how well Salem is doing in being a place without discrimination? And we could give a 1 to 5 or a 0 to 10 or a grade. I do feel like it is a subjective question. The trick is that we want the offered answers to be meaningful. So if I say, is Salem getting a C? You know, to some people, a C is like, okay, that's average, that's okay. And to some people, if they get a C, it's devastating, like, oh, that's such a terrible grade. And so I think there's a concern with the grade scale that, you know, there is relative, right? To everybody, A is better than B, which is better than C, but the emotion around a C may not be consistent. And so I think if we say, let's go to a 1 to 5 where, you know, it's very poor and 5 is excellent, or almost no discrimination and lots of discrimination. And I'm not anchoring it exactly how I would need to, but I do feel like we want like an overall, in your opinion, how are we doing? But I want options that at least, you know, I could say anybody who put a C or anybody who chooses that middle option at least is kind of in the same ballpark. So I feel like we've used the grading in the past. We have some reasons to move away from it, but I do feel like, you know, Mike, as you say, for the media to say like, hey, we got a C+, when you're reporting that, people are like, oh, okay, that's where we were. And to see if we've stayed the same or moved the needle. If we move away from the grading, then we lose that. But I do think that we could ask a frequency question and an overall perception question. I don't want to only ask a frequency question and not an overall perception question. Linnell?
I think I'm just personally leaning towards a number scale. I think that a frequency question would be extremely hard to answer for most people. And I get that a number scale, you're not going to have, you know, the person who feels like it's a 3 might not have the same feeling as another person who thinks it's a 3. And I think that's just part of the nature of what happens. But I think that if you're getting to how people feel, the number scale is probably a good way to go. And I think it's common. It's like when you go to a doctor, they ask, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's your pain? At the shelter, we ask ladies, you know, if they're saying they're really stressed today, it's like on a scale of 1 to 10, how's your stress level? And then we can talk about strategies for dealing with stress. And if it's like so high that any strategies I offer are going to be like beyond what they can do, it's like, okay, are you willing to see your counselor? This sounds like it's really above and beyond what you usually experience. So, you know, let's get you some help. But I think that number scale, it's going to be subjective, but frequency, I think, is going to be too hard for anyone to answer. And I mean, there's too many scopes, you know, the frequency this week versus last week or last month. And but a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, people are used to coming up with some sort of estimate for that, whether it's about pain or stress or, you know, discrimination. I think it would fit in there because it's one way we're used to thinking about it. And then on the students' end, you know, they could consider if it's 1 to 5, 3 is average and 4 is good and 5 is excellent, or the other direction, whichever way you're going. So I think you can associate those numbers with, you know, a name for it. But I don't think there's any way of getting away from the fact that I don't think a 3 is going to be the same for everybody, but it's going to be something that everybody could probably answer. And it would have some meaning, because even if I think a 3 average is just completely unacceptable and someone else thinks average is okay, I think you're still in the same ballpark that we're saying there's an average level. And I think that's something people can answer way better than a frequency, and it can correlate to categories that can indicate a score.
Sure.
Those are my thoughts.
Thank you. And if we do use a 1 to 5, we can match them up. Last year, we did give 5 options with the A, B, C, D, F. So they would, and we described last year, we said A, excellent, B, good, and we could use those same adjectives that would give us some option to compare. I feel like this is really helpful conversation, and I think I'm going to lean towards a 1 to 5 where we label those. And I'll get you guys the next version and you can look at that and say, yes, that works, or come let me know, what about this? Or do people in general feel good about a numbered? And the question is around give Salem a rating, an overall rating. The phrase we've used in the past is as a place without discrimination.
I wish that part was left out, just because that seems leading, and to me that almost seems invalidating. If I'm going to give it a score that it's tons of discrimination, I don't want to read that the presumption is that Salem has none. I would like that part to be like open-ended, so that
I'm happy to leave that out on the open-ended question, but I think like give Salem a rating. I feel like we do need to give people about what, like as a place to do business or as a traffic, like I think there's got to be something there about discrimination, so that we're saying give Salem a rating on this. And I think the intent is that as a place without discrimination is the ideal, that's what we're striving for.
I kind of understand what Linnell's saying there, because that's not even really what we're asking. We're asking people to rate the level of discrimination in Salem, or rate Salem as it relates to discrimination, but we're not asking them to. I think that wording is confusing. The more that I think about as a place without discrimination.
It's kind of awkward.
It's a little awkward and leading. So I just wonder about, rate the level of discrimination in Salem, or rate Salem with regard, I hate longer making things more wordy, but with regards to discrimination, or something that's more neutral. That
I like the level.
Without. The level of.
Yeah.
Does that still seem comparable to previous years, because it's the same 5-point scale and we're asking them to rate discrimination, and we're using excellent, good, average, fair, and poor?
Yeah, I think if we say rate the level of discrimination in Salem, when we say excellent, we would need to say none or very little discrimination with excellent.
Yeah.
But I do think it matches up.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I did want to also put on the table one other big picture, and then I'll go through kind of quickly on a few other points. I know, Linnell, we could kind of just start at the top and boom, 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 talk through a couple of things. The way that kind of the heart of the survey is structured, we say, here's the definition. Then we say, have you ever experienced discrimination? Yes or no. The people who say no skip several questions. And And the people who say yes, we say, think about the most recent incident. How long ago was it? What was the main cause? And was it here in Salem? So some of those people, the most recent incident wasn't in Salem, but they have experienced discrimination in Salem. And so we've done kind of this like, well, here's the percent of people in our survey that experienced discrimination in Salem, but it was their most recent incident. And I guess I would put on the table, would we rather ask in the first question, have you ever experienced discrimination in Salem? So that we're talking about the most recent incidents here instead of the most recent incidents people have experienced anywhere. And then the follow-up set is around witnessed and heard about. And that's, have you witnessed or heard about discrimination anywhere? And then we ask what percent of the most recent incidents were here. So we could similarly ask, have you heard or witnessed discrimination in Salem? Instead of talking broadly and then asking if it was in Salem, we could ask specifically to Salem. Did I describe that well enough to make sense? Maybe.
It sounds like your recommendation is around simplifying the survey so that it is about Salem from the get-go, and
Yes.
and that you're not asking then as many follow-up questions. Is that the gist of it?
Yeah, it would remove one follow-up question, but I think then it would also be more focused on Salem. So I feel like before people would say, oh yeah, I heard about, I've heard and seen discrimination. And then we say, was the most recent incident in Salem? And they say no, because it was on the news and it was across the country. But maybe they have also heard about and witnessed discrimination in Salem. It just wasn't the most recent one. And then we're not going to capture that because our follow-up questions are all focused on the most recent incident. So I'm wondering about in that first question about experience and the first question about witnessing or hearing about, if we specify Salem there.
Well, what do y'all think? I tend to think that makes sense to specify Salem.
Yeah, I agree. That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree too.
Great. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is just pull up my draft of the survey, and I'm just going to mention question, question, question. And if you want to stop me, stop me. So question 1 is age. Question 2, do you currently live or work in Salem? Both of those are at the beginning. So if people are under 18 or live and work more than 20 miles away from Salem, we say thanks so much, but you don't qualify. We don't need your, we're looking for people over 18 or over who live or work in Salem. Then we do the definition. Then we ask, have you experienced discrimination? How long ago? What was the main cause? Linnell, you had wondered about allowing people to check more than one for the main cause.
So I think yeah, I guess I want to go back to the beginning. I don't know if there's going to be a title page, but I wish that it might include like a little, like a tiny sentence or 3 about, you know, the Human Rights Commission is dedicated to ensuring that every person who lives in Salem is treated fairly. And we are conducting this survey to kind of see what your experiences have been so that we can improve as needed. So something to kind of give it an anchor about why are we even doing this, and give them, you know, any information that we actually have a Human Rights Commission. So I wish there's a title page or like an introductory paragraph.
And we'll definitely include something like that.
And,
Yeah,
and
thanks.
it kind of gives the vision of like what we want. And we want to know, is that what you're getting, so that we can improve.
Yep.
And
I made notes while you were talking. That was a great intro. I liked it.
And then I was going to say, could the, you know, age and location of where you live go to the end, but now I totally see why you have it in the beginning. I would just wonder that I imagine that for doing this for people who are living in poverty, whether they're homeless or not, we're more often than not going to be using a print copy than an online copy. So maybe some language that, you know, on the computer version, you're not going to need to do anything. But if I was doing this in person, I'd want to know that if they're under 18 and not living in Salem, I need to stop the survey right there. So I think there would need to either be a difference in the print copy or a sentence on the even on the online copy that says, you know, we're not going further if you don't live in Salem or you're not over 18.
Yeah. The survey language is thank and dismiss, and that's the note that I put there, but I'm happy to add a little bit more.
No, that makes total sense, and I missed that. So I think even in the print copy, as long as I remember that that's there and actually read what's in front of me, that would work. You already had it covered. I just didn't notice.
No worries.
And then I wonder about question 3, if it's even necessary about having people add or change the definition. When I was doing the survey last year in person with people, that question, like people, it's like, you just told me what it means for your parameters, and then you're asking me whether I need to change it. And that totally stops the flow of the whole survey. It's like people would be ready to go to the next question, but now I'm asking them to think about the definition. And I don't know if that's necessary. There might be reasons that it is, but as far as the actual process of doing that survey in person, that question just kind of stumps people, like, because now they got to go back to the definition and think about whether that really fits what they think discrimination is, or they're just not going to do it at all because, you know, like put no, because I'm not going to go back and do that. So I don't know if that one is as relevant or necessary to even be on the list.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, every question, if we look at that and say, does this add? I think that's a great question to ask. Last year, 90% of the respondents put no, that they didn't have anything to change or add. And the 10% who did, they put a comment in, and I could pull some of those up to see the kinds of things that they wanted to change or add. The idea behind giving people that option, we wanted to give the definition to ground everybody and say, this is what we're talking about. And there was discussion around if somebody said, oh, but you're missing this. And I think it's that we didn't want them to go through the whole survey feeling like they never had a chance to tell us that. And so giving somebody a space at the beginning to say, I think you need to add this, or I think you should consider this. We hoped then they would say, okay, I've expressed where I'm coming from, and now I can see we're using this definition and I'll go forward. But you're right. I mean, 90% of people put no.
To your recollection, do you recall the nature of any of those comments? I know you don't have them in front of you, but I'm just curious if they were wildly different things that people added to the definition, or if they were more minor points to the definition, because I think even within that 10%, it might not be enough variation from the definition that it's worth asking. And I agree with Linnell. I had never thought about, I'd never thought about how different the survey would be when administered in person. And we're dedicated now to administering this in person to that population because it's so important for our work. I'd just be curious how different that 10% would have put it, and whether we're really getting a lot of value out of that question.
Yeah. I'm going to pull up some of their comments as we're going. In 2017, the definition we gave was simply the unjust and prejudicial treatment of different types of people. And there were quite a few more people who wanted to add things, and they wanted to add on grounds of and types of things. Instead of just this general types of people, they wanted to add what types of people. And some people did not like the phrase types of people. My recollection, and I'm still pulling it up, is that last year there were comments specific about, we give a list on grounds of these specific things. And the comments were around grounds for discrimination that were not included in that list.
It's like you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't, right?
Yeah. So in
when
one
we
year,
ask the general question and don't list all the categories, we hear, why aren't these categories listed? If you ask the specific question with all the categories, it's like, well, there are some that are missing. And there will always be some that are missing.
correct.
Yeah, that's a challenge.
Yeah.
Can we incorporate that with question 24, where we're asking if there's anything else you want to tell us, or even just move that question towards the end? Because then that deals with the flow issue a little bit better, but still gives that opportunity. Or, if we did eliminate it, would people then use question 24 to tell us that? I don't know how much, do we have that in all of our surveys, the option to add additional comments?
It actually is unusual in survey writing in general, but we have always offered a question in this HRC survey. I sometimes do a survey where the whole survey, I'm waiting for an opportunity to tell them something and they never ask me. And I'm like, oh. And generally, if you're writing a survey about toothpaste, there's a specific objective, you're making a specific decision. And if someone wanted to tell you something, but it didn't have to do with the decision you're trying to make, it's not a great loss that you didn't hear it. But we have felt like in this survey, we want to give a space, and most people will leave it blank. But some people want the opportunity to say, I didn't feel like you addressed this very well, or thanks for doing this, or I have this concern, or I want to voice this opinion. And I feel like we've offered that, even though it's unusual, to be honest, in a survey, because I don't want anybody to get to the end of the survey and not feel like the point of doing this is to hear everybody's voice. And if they get to the end of the survey and they have something to tell us, I want to hear it. So I do think we offered that space at the end, expecting most people would leave it blank, but thinking that some people would appreciate the opportunity to voice something. But to say,
based on what,
go ahead.
Well, a couple things. I'm mindful of time. We ran over with this meeting last time, so I'm a little mindful of time. But based on what you're saying, were the comments on question 3, I think it is, and the fact that we have the open-ended question at the end, I am comfortable with removing question 3, but I want to hear from the others, because I think Linnell's observation is one that has some real merit, which is that are we just asking a question that affects a small amount of people and is a small concern as opposed to a big concern, that the 10% who are adding on are sort of not always adding something that is a deal breaker for the rest of the survey, which I think was the concern, and the reason why it was included high up was that it might be a deal breaker. So I just wanted to get feelers on the room about whether we should just consider removing that question or other thoughts. And I also want to make sure, sorry, one other thing, Lynn, I know you're dying. One other thing is I want to make sure we get to the distribution plan. And so we kind of have to move quickly through any other concerns through the rest of the questions.
I'm ignoring my phone, but I can't turn it off. If you're going to do that introductory paragraph of why we're doing this survey, if it had just a sentence saying no survey can possibly be perfect. However, we do have space for comments at the end if you think the survey itself should be different, or if you have input that is not already considered in one of the questions, please be free in sharing your input on question 30 or whatever. So I think you can kind of address that right up front. And then people aren't just waiting for that opportunity for comment, not knowing if it's ever going to happen. And if you did that, then that question could go away, because whether I disagree with the definition, or I think it should have more, or I want you to know that the police suck, or whatever, I know I can have a space for that comment.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I also feel like we could, if we're not asking, like, evaluate this definition, add to it, if we just say, for the purposes of this survey, here's how we're defining it. That can just come right at the beginning. And then it's not it kind of feels like school, right? To be like, here's our definition. Do you think that's good? Do you want to add anything? And I think we really do want to get into hearing about people's experiences and perceptions more than asking them to critique a definition.
Yeah, I'm
And
fine with
raising the head
removing it
nods. Okay.
and then maybe adding that note like Linnell said.
Great suggestion, Linnell. Thank you.
Yeah. I do, just from a time standpoint, want to ask a few questions around the demographics. So those are questions at the end where we say, you know, basically tell us about you. And the reason that we're including those is because we want to be able to compare the data. We have a gender question. So I'm now looking at question 18, and it says, what is your gender? Female, male, non-binary, prefer to self-describe with an option to fill in and prefer not to say. I see that question as, what is your gender identity? It's a question that is different, presented in different ways. And I wanted to put it to the commission to see how you feel about, what is your gender? How is that, you feel good about that wording, or is there something else we ought to consider?
I prefer that wording to gender identity. I think gender identity gets into that. Gender identity is an important concept, especially when we're talking about discrimination, because you can be discriminated against for your gender. You can also be discriminated against for your identity, maybe not matching up with what somebody else thinks your gender should conform to. But when we're asking the demographic question, it is a gender. To call it a gender identity gets into that idea that it's a preference. And it's not a preference. It just is a gender. So I think that's, and I see Tricarico nodding, so I feel good about that, that we're on the same page. So I think it's, what is your gender is the appropriate there.
I'm very happy to take your recommendation. I just wanted to make sure you'd seen that and weighed in, and given that we're doing it the way that works. That's awesome. Thank you. Question 20, do you identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community? I see that that was our 2020 question. LGBTQIA plus, do we want to add the IA this year?
Yeah, we actually formally changed the name of our LGBTQIA plus task force, mainly because we want straight people to have a hard time saying it. I'm just kidding.
It's a lot of letters. I'm trying.
We have a really robust LGBTQIA plus community here in Salem, and we have some strong advocates of those identities that are represented in INA. And so we for sure, I think, want to be inclusive there.
Great. So I will add IA. I see thumbs up. Excellent. We added a question about experiencing homelessness that we did not have last year. Disability, do you have a disability, is just a yes, no. We could do a follow-up if it was meaningful, useful, actionable. For those who said yes, to ask a type of disability, physical, mental, we have in the causes for discrimination. Is that?
So that one can be a little tricky because there are a lot of members of the deaf community who do not consider themselves disabled, even though by like the legal definition they are. So that could be a little tricky. Just for that reason, I don't really have a solution. I know we don't have a lot of time, but that's something to consider.
Is the, do you have a disability question useful? Do we include it? Do we cut it? I did read, I mean, I saw a list of 8 disabilities, so we could just ask all 8. But again, I think the question to the commission is, what is useful?
I think if some of the earlier questions ask what was the discrimination based on, and the options include mental and physical disability. So you kind of get a piece of that data just by some of the prior questions.
The prior questions would help us understand if they experienced discrimination for one of those or observed, but I could have a disability and the recent discrimination I'm thinking of, that incident may not have anything to do with that.
That speaks to a different question. And, I don't know if we have time for this, but this is like the most important one to me. I feel like if you hone in on the most recent experience, you're really not getting the data that you're hoping for. I could be at the grocery store and witness somebody being, very prejudicial to a lady who's Asian in the line next to me. And that becomes my most recent one. And that's the one I need to write about for this survey, when all day, every day, I'm seeing people being discriminated against for poverty and homelessness. So I would really wish that the question was more like, in your, during the last 6 months, what types of discrimination have you witnessed or experienced? Because as soon as it's the most recent, that's chance. That's not a pattern that's happening. That's not indicative of the scope of what I'm seeing. If the most recent was happening to an Asian lady at the grocery store, that is not reflective of my overall experience of discrimination in Salem. And I'm not really sure about the relevance of the most recent. I think that just takes it purely to chance and not to the scope and context of my life and what's really happening. And I feel like if the survey was looking for, a level of discrimination, isolating it to the most recent really undoes the exact goal that you're trying to get to, from what I understand. And if it was, and I realize it's bigger to say, what types of discrimination have you witnessed or experienced during the last 3 months or 6 months? But I think that even though that's subjective and it's not going to be an exact number, it's going to give you a better feel for what's really going on in Salem than my most recent one, which is pure chance.
So the benefit of having several hundred people answer this is that because we have several hundred people sharing their experiences, the most recent for all those several hundred people, we hope would be reflective of the levels that reflect reality. I think it's challenging for people to look back at 3 months or 6 months and summarize all of that. But if each person says, well, this is the most recent, if all day, every day, we have a lot of people experiencing discrimination for one cause, most of those, that will be their most recent. And so I think the expectation, because we're not just talking to one person, if we were doing a smaller size study with interviews, we would definitely say, let's have conversations about a bigger timeline and multiple causes. I do feel like where we're talking to several hundred people, getting responses from several hundred, hearing the most recent from all of those people, that chance, as you talk about, will shake out. And we will see, okay, the most recent experience for these 300 people, we have more discrimination on these grounds and less on those grounds.
I tend to agree, Marianne, because this is not a sociological study in that way, that we're going deep into individual experiences. It's an overall broad community survey, and the law of numbers is going to provide us with that window. And if the most recent experience, for example, for an individual was witnessing a certain type of discrimination, like the Asian American example that you gave, and there are several people who very recently witnessed that same type of discrimination, then that is a pattern within the community that we wouldn't identify by doing a more deep sociological method. So I tend to agree with Marianne that we're actually going to get better data from asking for the most recent. It sounds a little bit counterintuitive to the individual experience, but it gives us a better window into the aggregate experience.
I see your point, and obviously I'm going to support it and be grateful that we're having the survey. And I think that if you allowed multiple responses, you know, if I could say during the last 3 months, I've experienced and witnessed discrimination based on ethnicity, based on homelessness, based on income level, then I'm kind of getting more of a feel that still includes the most recent, but isn't exclusive to the most recent. And if everybody was doing that, I think you're going to get a better aggregate, even though I can see that the numbers might play out in the way that you're saying. If we're asking people to like give it a scale of 1 to 5, but my most recent is not even about what I'm mostly experiencing. I wish there was a way to just say, you know, what have you witnessed in the last 3 months, and you know what types of discrimination, because you're just giving it a longer time frame. So I could say, you know, based on ethnicity, based on homelessness, based on this, and it's not exclusive to just pick one. And the aggregate would be from everybody, including the last 3 months or so. So I would lean that way, but I'm going to support anything.
Yeah, thanks for articulating your point, and I hear where you're coming from. Yeah. I feel like this input has been really helpful. I feel like the big questions that I came in with, like, is this going to work? And how do we think about this? And where does the task force net out? I feel like we've been able to talk about pretty much all of those. I had a little list and I think we've done really well.
Before we part, Marianne, and we are a little over time, is everyone okay for just a couple more minutes? I see nods. I would like to talk about the distribution plan. You also had a plan to invite members of this task force to assist with some of the distribution. I know the date that you're looking at, I'm not available and I'm really bummed. But did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Love to, thank you. So the general distribution, we have kind of a multi-prong approach, if you will. And one of the questions we specifically ask, like, how did the survey find you? And one of the options is through the City of Salem Facebook page, website, and email list. That's how we distributed it last year. So by asking that, we can take people who check that box and we can compare that to last year. So that's giving us an option there. We also would like to actively invite more people to complete the survey and reach out kind of with judgment to say, so a judgment sample to reach out to groups or clubs or organizations that may have a list of people in Salem that might have a particular interest in human rights here and be willing to take the 5 or 10 minutes to complete the survey. And then also to go out to invite people experiencing homelessness to complete the survey in hard copy. And Linnell has graciously offered to help us do that. And we are targeting the afternoon of Saturday, May 8th. So from 1 to 4, I'll have a group of students come, and Linnell and I will meet and have a big stack of hard copies and just go and sit with people as they fill it out. And you are welcome to come help us do that. So that's Saturday, the 8th, from 1 to 4 in the afternoon. We also would welcome ideas, contacts, because last year we said, let's just put it on Facebook and send it out through the city's newsletter, email distribution. We will use the City of Salem Facebook page that's in Spanish. And if any of you clicked as you went through the survey on the Qualtrics link, you could switch between English and Espanol. So when you click on that, it shows Espanol, and then you can kind of toggle back and forth on the questions. A lot of these questions are the same as last year's. And so the translation from last year is there. I wanted to get it in English where we all kind of said, yep, we're on board, we like it, and then we'll clean up the translation. So we will have it available in Spanish. But if any of you on the commission say, okay, we've worked with these organizations and we can ask these organizations if they would send it out to their lists. I think any help in terms of getting the survey out to people who live or work in Salem that would be willing to share their opinions and perceptions on this, I think is great.
One question, Marianne, on the Spanish distribution.
Yes.
When we advertise it on the Spanish Facebook, for instance, or if we were to share it with any local organizations that have primarily Spanish speakers, as an example, is it possible for that link then to default to the Spanish version, or are they still going to have to toggle each question?
So once you switch it to Spanish, the whole survey will be in Spanish unless you switch back.
Okay.
I don't know that I can fiddle with it and see if there's a way to go directly into Spanish and stay in Spanish unless you want to toggle yourself over to English. I mean, if we invite somebody in Spanish to do the questionnaire and they click on the link, it would sure be ideal if it comes up in Spanish.
Yeah.
So I will follow up on that.
It might be when you hit that toggle button that it actually changes the URL, and maybe that's a way, but I don't know if that changes the URL or not. But okay. Okay, thanks for looking into that. Any further questions on the distribution plan? The invitation is open for task force members to go on the 8th. Like I said, I'm going out of town, and I really wish I could be there and see how people interact with the survey. Please report back how it goes to us, because that's going to be.
No, I'll be going out on more days than the 8th, so anybody can join me on any day.
Ooh, I'll contact you, Linnell, for that opportunity. That's wonderful. Any other questions on the distribution plan? Comments for this evening?
I would target agencies that deal with people who are living in poverty, because people who are in poverty are often marginalized, whether they're homeless or not. So any service providers that serve people who are very low income, I think would be really important to connect with.
When we get to putting together that judgment sample and sending out that email, that would be a good opportunity to do that. So we can chat about that with Gretchen as we are putting together that judgment sample. So I think that that's a really good consideration, Linnell. Thank you.
And I think the only other thing I had, which is like relating to a question, is that when we ask people what would help them if they've been discriminated against, it all seems about after the fact band-aids, where I wish it would also include, and I realize people wouldn't know necessarily what would fix this, but how, what could the question include that sometimes we're going to be less othered if people understand more about us. So maybe one of the things that we list as far as what could be done, what would help if you've been discriminated against, would be education about, my population, because that's more of a proactive, let's try to prevent discrimination by enabling more understanding, as opposed to, well, now I need counseling. So, that if what next could be not just about how do I help myself feel better, even though I've been discriminated against, but if that question could include some options for how do we prevent discrimination from reoccurring. And I think education about different populations is one of the ways to do that. And even if a person wouldn't know that might solve it, maybe the list of answers could include education to enable more people to understand your culture or your population, so that there's a proactive option as opposed to just a reactive, how do I feel better now that I've been discriminated against? But just one idea.
It's a great idea. And I think it's easy to include an additional option like that, and one around education makes sense to me.
Yeah, I like that as well.
So next steps on my end, I'm going to take all your input and rework stuff. And I'll meet with the students tomorrow evening and we'll go through it. And then I'll send it back. And as quickly as we can kind of have the go ahead from this task force, if you go through it and you're like, oh, this has this other question in my mind, or you missed this one piece of our feedback, like, let's get this right. And it's worth, if you say, oh, you used the wrong kind of there here, or like those kinds of things in a survey, we want them right. So don't hesitate to get feedback back to me and we'll get it right. And, or at least it's not gonna be perfect, but at least as good, put our best foot forward as we can. And then we'll get it out into field. And we did build a little more time this year than last. We need to close for the parameters of the class by May 20th. So as soon as we can say, yep, we feel great about this survey, let's send it out, then we have that time to, send it out and invite response and post it on Facebook and go out in the community and invite people to give us their input.
Marianne, I don't think we can thank you enough for your openness and your willingness to work through. Surveys are awfully complicated, aren't they? Things to come up with, and it's just such a joy to work with you and the students. We did have another agenda item around progress on videos for awareness. There has been no progress in the last month, so I think I'd like to just end with that on that agenda item. I don't think we need to do any more discussion on that. We can take that up at a later meeting. We do have space for member remarks and announcements. We are a little bit over time. So does anyone have any member remarks and announcements this evening? All right. Well, I think then we can adjourn for the evening. Marianne, I'll see you tomorrow, and there will be some email activity as she refines the survey. Keep an eye on it, but at some point, we'll just cut it off and we'll have to hit go on it. So the survey will be as good as it is at the time that we release it. We'll get to work on this project, hopefully much more in the future. It's a really important project for our community. Many thanks to Linnell for being our guest, our awareness members. And with that, I think we can adjourn.
Thank you all for your thoughtful input.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.